Be me, just a regular guy. Have a good friend I've known for years. We'll call him Mark. Mark has an older sister, Susan. And Susan is, well, she's the type of person who finds a way to be professionally offended by everything. You know the kind. The world is a giant conspiracy against her, and the name of that conspiracy is the patriarchy. A sunset is beautiful, but it's also a reminder that the day, much like female autonomy, is fleeting. Stuff like that. We mostly got along by just nodding and avoiding certain topics. It was a delicate peace treaty. This whole story kicked off a few months back, maybe late summer. Mark invited me over for a small get-together. Just him, me, Susan, and her best friend, Maya. The evening was going surprisingly well. We were talking about movies, work, mundane stuff. The peace treaty was holding. Then Susan checked her phone. Her face soured instantly. She let out this theatrical, exasperated sigh and tossed her phone onto the sofa cushion next to her. Mark, knowing better but doing it anyway, asked what was wrong. That was the spark. The lecture began. Apparently, some guy on Hinge had committed the cardinal sin of opening with, "Hey, random question, but you look tall in your pics. How tall are you?" To you and me, that's a normal question. To Susan, it was a microaggression of seismic proportions. She launched into a full-blown dissertation on how dating apps were the pinnacle of everything wrong with modern society. It was a digital meat market, she said, designed by tech bros to turn human connection into a transaction. She complained that men just swipe on pictures without reading bios, reducing women to a set of physical attributes. The height question, she explained with the patience of a professor scolding a child, wasn't about curiosity. It was a screening mechanism, an attempt to quantify her before even learning her name. She was being treated like a product on a shelf, and she was sick of it. Maya, who was a lot more down-to-earth, tried to offer a different perspective. She said it's just an efficient way to see if you're compatible, and that women do the exact same thing with jobs, heights, and a million other details. This was like throwing gasoline on a bonfire. Susan declared that the entire system was rotten to the core. It had conditioned men to be lazy, superficial, and utterly incapable of initiating genuine, real-world interactions. When was the last time a man approached a woman in a coffee shop or a bookstore? She demanded, looking at me and Mark. It doesn't happen anymore. They've lost all courage. They'd rather hide behind a screen and send a low-effort hey than risk rejection in person. She went on about how people used to meet organically, through friends, at parties, through shared hobbies. She painted this romantic picture of a bygone era where connection was based on personality and chemistry, not on a curated set of 6 photos and a witty prompt. Then came the big announcement. She picked up her phone, held it aloft like a trophy, and proclaimed she was done. Finished. She was conducting an experiment. She was going to prove that real life was superior. She was deleting every single dating app from her phone. Tinder, Bumble, Hinge, all of it. Her goal was to find a meaningful connection the old-fashioned way. She was going to prove that a confident, interesting woman could still attract a high-quality man without resorting to what she called digital pandering. Mark and I just stayed silent, exchanging a look that said, "Do not engage." I repeat, do not engage. But Maya, bless her heart, decided to poke the bear. She calmly took a sip of her drink and said, "Okay, Susan, I hear you. But you do realize that organic dating is a two-way street, right?" Susan looked at her, confused. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Maya continued, "if you're waiting for a guy to approach you in a coffee shop, you might be waiting a long time. These days, guys are terrified of being called a creep for just talking to a woman. If you want this to work, you're going to have to be the one to initiate sometimes. You can't just sit there and expect them to read your mind and brave a potential public shaming." Susan scoffed. actually scoffed. She said that was nonsense. A truly confident man, the kind of man she was looking for, would know the difference between a welcome advance and harassment. It was all about the signals a woman sends: body language, eye contact, an open and inviting demeanor. She was convinced that if she simply put herself out there in the right environments, the right kind of man would pick up on her signals and make his move. She wouldn't have to do the man's job of initiating. With a dramatic flourish, she held down the app icons one by one, and the little X appeared. She deleted them all. The room was quiet for a moment. Susan had this smug, triumphant look on her face, like she'd just won a major moral victory. Mark just sighed and changed the subject. The next week or two, according to Mark, Susan was on cloud nine. She talked constantly about how liberating it was. No more mindless swiping. No more dealing with vapid conversations. No more anxiety about who should message first. She felt free. She described it as seeing the world in color again after years of looking at a black and white screen. She started planning her excursions. She wasn't just going out. She was strategically placing herself in high opportunity zones: artisan coffee shops with communal tables, indie bookstores with poetry readings, weekend farmers markets, and even the dog park, though she doesn't own a dog. Her first major field test was a couple of weeks later, on a Saturday afternoon. She put on a nice outfit, effortless but chic, as she later described it to Mark. She grabbed a classic novel she'd already read, something that would make her look intellectual, and headed to one of those super trendy coffee shops downtown. The place was busy. She ordered her oat milk latte and scanned the room. Her eyes landed on him almost immediately. Let's call him Kevin. According to her debrief, Kevin was perfect. He looked to be around her age, was well-dressed but not flashy, and was sitting alone, deeply focused on a book. Not on his phone, a book. A huge plus in her mind. This was it. This was the scene she had romanticized in her head. There was an empty two-person table directly in his line of sight. She snagged it. Now, Operation Signal was a go. A normal person might just walk over and say, "Hey, what are you reading?" "It looks interesting." Not Susan. That would be aggressive and masculine. Instead, she executed a complex, silent ballet of seduction that only she understood. Step 1. Make her presence known. She sat down, arranged her book and coffee just so, and then looked up, letting her gaze drift around the room until it accidentally fell on him. Step 2. The eye contact. She held his gaze for a fraction of a second longer than normal, then offered a small, mysterious smile before looking down at her book. Step 3. The hair flip. A few minutes later, she glanced up again, and when he happened to be looking in her general direction, she casually tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. She repeated variations of this for the better part of an hour. The glance, the smile, the thoughtful sip of coffee while looking his way, the subtle arching of her back. From what Mark told me, she was genuinely convinced she was weaving some kind of irresistible spell. And what was Kevin's response to this masterclass in nonverbal communication? Nothing. He glanced up a couple of times, saw her looking, and gave that quick, polite, "I acknowledge your existence" nod that you give to strangers. Then he went right back to his book. He wasn't ignoring her. He just genuinely had no idea he was the target of an elaborate one-woman covert operation. The barista, a young guy with tattoos, was apparently watching the whole thing with a look of profound confusion. After about 90 minutes, Kevin finished his coffee, packed up his book, and walked out. He didn't even look in her direction on his way to the door. Susan was floored and furious. She texted Mark a novel-length rant from the coffee shop. It wasn't her fault, of course. It was his. He was clearly emotionally unavailable, or too intimidated by a strong woman. Or her favorite theory. He was another casualty of the dating app plague, so socially inept that he couldn't recognize clear, obvious signals of interest. The idea that her signals were maybe not as clear as she thought did not enter the equation. Maya tried to gently suggest that maybe her signals were, in fact, just her looking at a guy in a coffee shop, which is something people do all the time without any romantic intent. Susan dismissed this as Maya being conditioned by the patriarchy to accept low standards. Undeterred, she decided she needed to change her strategy. The coffee shop was too ambiguous. She needed a venue with built-in interaction. So, she joined a book club. This was a brilliant move, in her mind. It filtered for men who were literate, intelligent, and capable of long-form conversation. The first meeting was about a month after the coffee shop incident. The book was some dense historical fiction novel. She went in with a new plan. She would dazzle a potential partner with her intellect. Her target this time was a guy who seemed smart and articulate during the introductions. We'll call him Book Club Guy. When the discussion started, she waited for him to offer an opinion. He made a thoughtful point about the author's use of symbolism. This was her chance to build a connection, to agree and add her own insight, to find common ground. Instead, she decided the best way to impress him was to prove she was smarter. She didn't just disagree with his point, she systematically dismantled it. She called his interpretation a bit simplistic and missing the obvious socio-political subtext. She wasn't flirting, she wasn't debating, she was lecturing. The vibe in the room, Mark heard later, went from a friendly book chat to a tense academic showdown in about 30 seconds. Book Club Guy tried to defend his point, but she kept cutting him off to correct him. He was visibly uncomfortable. After a few minutes of this, he just sort of deflated and said, "Well, that's an interesting perspective. You've given me a lot to think about. It was the universal code for, please stop talking to me now." Susan took it as a victory. She thought she had impressed him with her formidable mind. During the post-discussion mingling time, she saw him talking to another woman from the group. She tried to position herself nearby, waiting for him to come over and continue their stimulating conversation. He never did. He actively avoided making eye contact with her for the rest of the evening. At the end of the night, he left with the other woman. They were laughing together. The post-mortem on this failure was even more spectacular. She concluded that Book Club Guy was a pseudo-intellectual who was intimidated by a woman who actually challenged him. He preferred the other woman, she theorized, because she was more docile and agreeable, and therefore less threatening to his fragile male ego. At this point, it had been nearly 2 months since the great deleting. Her grand experiment in organic dating had yielded 0 dates, 0 numbers, and 0 promising interactions. Her initial optimism had curdled into a bitter, simmering resentment. The world, it seemed, was refusing to play by the rules of her romantic fantasy. And in her mind, the fault lay squarely with the world, not with her. You're trying to play 4D chess in places where people are just playing checkers. You need to go somewhere casual, where the pressure is off. Her solution, a regular, normal bar. Not a quiet wine bar or a high-concept cocktail lounge. Just a popular spot downtown with music, crowds, and a relaxed atmosphere. Susan was hesitant. A bar felt too cliché, too much like the meat market she was trying to escape. But she was also getting desperate, so she agreed. They went out on a Friday night a couple of weeks later. The place was packed. The energy was good. For the first hour, things seemed okay. They got a table, had a couple of drinks, and people watched. Maya was in her element, chatting with people, laughing. Susan was a storm cloud in the corner. She just sat there, nursing her drink, scanning the room with this intense, judgmental glare. She wasn't sending signals anymore. She was radiating an aura of do not approach. Maya, ever the good friend, tried to help her out. She leaned over the table and said, "Okay, see that group of guys over by the bar? The one in the green shirt has been looking over here a few times. He's cute. You should go talk to him." Susan looked at her like she'd suggested she should go set the building on fire. The horror on her face was comical, according to Maya's later retelling. "What? Me? Go over there?" she whispered, as if the idea itself was physically painful. "Yeah," Maya said. "Just go say hi. What's the worst that can happen?" And then Susan said the quiet part out loud, the core thesis of her entire failed philosophy. "I can't do that. That's the man's job. Approaching a man first is desperate. It's unfeminine. It completely flips the dynamic. I'm not going to do their work for them." Maya just stared at her for a long, silent moment, and then she said, "Susan, do you hear yourself? You complain that men don't approach anymore, but you refuse to approach them. You want to have a real-world connection, but you're unwilling to take a real-world risk. You're treating real life like it's Bumble, where you just sit back and wait for the man to make the first move after you've both indicated interest. That's not how it works out here." Susan had no comeback. She just crossed her arms and glared at the table. The night went on. Green shirt guy eventually started talking to another girl who had no problem walking up to him. Maya ended up meeting someone too, a guy who came over to their table and started a conversation. He was nice, normal, funny. They hit it off. The whole night, Susan just sat there, stewing in her own ideological prison. She went home alone, angrier and more confused than ever. The following weeks were grim. Mark said she barely went out anymore. The grand experiment was a catastrophic failure, and the cognitive dissonance was breaking her brain. She had constructed this narrative where she was the heroine, bravely resisting a flawed system. But the system didn't care. The world just kept turning, and people kept meeting and falling in love, both online and off. Everyone except her. Her problem wasn't the apps. It was her own rigid, self-defeating rules about how the world should work, rather than engaging with how it actually works. The breaking point, the moment the dam finally burst, came about a month ago. It was another Friday night. Susan was at home, alone, scrolling through her phone, probably feeling a potent mix of loneliness and self-righteousness. And then she saw it. Maya had posted a picture on her social media. It was a photo of her and the guy she met at the bar. They were on a weekend trip somewhere, hiking. They looked incredibly happy. Genuinely, effortlessly happy. The caption was something simple, like, "Best weekend with this one." And in that moment, seeing that picture, the entire edifice of Susan's worldview crumbled. It wasn't about theories anymore. It wasn't about patriarchy or organic connections or who should approach whom. It was just a picture of her best friend, who was happy, with a man she met because she was willing to be open and engaged with the world. While Susan, the enlightened one, was sitting alone in her apartment on a Friday night with nothing but her failed principles for company, all her intellectual justifications evaporated, and she was left with a single, raw, painful feeling: loneliness. She realized that her crusade hadn't freed her. It had isolated her. She had been so obsessed with finding a man in the right way that she had completely forgotten how to just connect with a person. And then came the really hard realization, the one she'd been avoiding for months. She scrolled back in her mind through all the failed attempts. The guy in the coffee shop, the guy in the book club, the guy at the bar. In every single scenario, she had waited. She had waited for them to notice her. She had waited for them to read her signals. She had waited for them to take the risk, to cross the room, to start the conversation, to face potential rejection. All she had been willing to do was sit there and be the prize. She finally understood. The problem wasn't that dating apps had made men lazy. The problem was that dating apps had allowed her to be lazy. They were a crutch. They were a system that allowed her to avoid every single bit of social risk while demanding that men take all of it. On an app, she could swipe right, a zero-risk, zero-effort gesture, and then sit back and judge the quality of the men who were brave enough to actually send a message and start a conversation. Real life demanded more. It demanded courage. It demanded vulnerability. It demanded that sometimes you have to be the one to walk across the room. And she had refused. She had blamed men for not wanting to play a game where they took all the risks and she took none. It was a bitter pill to swallow. So what did she do with this profound, earth-shattering epiphany? Did she resolve to change, to become more proactive, to start initiating in the real world? Of course not. That would be too hard. She chose the easier path, the path of surrender. A few nights ago, Mark sent me a text. It just said, "You are not going to believe this." Attached was a screenshot. I opened it. It was a Tinder profile. The first picture was a slightly old one of Susan, where you could tell it was her, but it wasn't super obvious. A strategic choice, no doubt. The name on the profile was just S, but it was the bio that was the real masterpiece. The final, perfect monument to her hypocrisy. It read, "Tired of the games and superficiality. Looking for a genuine connection with someone who isn't afraid to have a real conversation. Don't be shy. Say hi." I had to read it 3 times to fully appreciate the layers of irony. After months of railing against the meat market, after a failed crusade to live in the real world, she had crawled back. She didn't just crawl back, she jumped back and head first. She couldn't handle a world that required her to put in the same effort she demanded from others. It was easier to go back to the system she hated, because, at least in that system, she could sit on her throne and wait for the suitors to come to her. So much for the revolution.